I call Fletcher Tabutoa.
Thank you very much, sir. Mr Bishop, I've held you in too high regard for such a long period of time. Either that or your heart just wasn't in it tonight. It just fell flat, mate. And I can understand why. I can understand why. This is a terrible piece of legislation. It really is. I was waiting at the start of the contribution from the Minister. Don't start, Seymour. You were saying the worst things about this during Select Committee. I couldn't believe it. It was amazing. But the Minister started off, and I was waiting. I was listening, sir. I was paying attention, looking for something I could comment on. But in the end, he just laid out the speech that was given to him and spoke to the generalities and spoke to the executive summary and just how wonderful it all really is. So, and then I at least had the excitement of hearing Mr Bennett contribute to the debate. At least that was entertaining. It wasn't very good, but it was entertaining. His abuse of people never fails to entertain this House night after night. And as the chairman of the Finance and Expenditure Select Committee, he won't mind if I don't refer from now on to a single word he said, and instead refer to the experts who contributed to the Select Committee process. $918,000, Miss Maggie Barry, $918,000, the average price of an Auckland house as of today, according to the data. So, you know, Miss Barry might be able to afford a property in Auckland, but new homeowners can't, sir. They're struggling. And that's not even new homeowners anymore. The reality is it's harder and harder for everyday New Zealanders, and this is intergenerational theft, and she needs to acknowledge that, and the National Party needs to acknowledge that, and do something more meaningful and tangible than this vacuous and empty piece of legislation, Mr Speaker. There were 3 minority reports written for the Select Committee report on this piece of legislation. I'm sure there would have been a 4th if Mr Seymour had been so inclined, but there were 3, and that speaks to the majority that is written about in the Select Committee report. I'm just going to take a snippet to highlight New Zealand First starts from their first reading on this bill, Mr Speaker, because we would normally say to the House, you've got it wrong, you've kind of missed the point, but what we'll do, sir, is support it through to Select Committee and let's see if you take on what was contributed from the experts. What we found when the draft legislation originally came out, there was nothing. There was absolutely nothing in this piece of legislation which was so facile, and I said the word vacuous already, that it does, sir, serve no point whatsoever. And it will achieve none of the stated objectives so eloquently spoken to tonight from the National Government. This is another token gesture, Mr Speaker, and I'll just quote from some of the submitters just to reinforce the point. This isn't New Zealand First simply opposing legislation for the sake of legislation. We, unlike Mr Seymour and the government, actually listened to the experts. Chartered Accountants Australia and New Zealand said quite simply that this is not sound tax policy. They recommend a stocktake or review, and said in the absence of this review, the overall package of reforms will lack the coherence it requires and will not provide taxpayers with an appropriate degree of certainty. The New Zealand Law Society said that this legislation should not be enacted as it would not meet the stated policy objectives. One submitter, KPMG, stated categorically that the bill does not address many of their concerns. They further said the bright line rule is not required, that it should be sufficient for inland revenue to enforce current legislation, which is what New Zealand First said right from the start, Mr Speaker. Chapman Tripp stated that there is no integrity in what is proposed and spoke specifically then about the avoidance rule for company or trust ownership structures. The New Zealand Property Investors Association stated that there is no need for this bill. It will not change the value of house prices. It will not lower them, sir. Then they pointed out that it is possible that properties bought under a company or a trust ownership structure could circumvent the bright line test rule yet again. They noted that speculators will simply change their behaviour, and this is piecemeal, and the government should simply enforce current legislation. My words, they should simply enforce the current capital gains tax, Mr. Scott. National and those sitting opposite deny there is one, but it is a tax that is enforceable given circumstances where owners of property dispose of said property and make a financial or gain on the sale of capital, Mr. Speaker. It is a capital gains tax and it simply needs to be enforced. Mr. Speaker, there is a real problem in Auckland, and it's not just local commentators. Commentators from around the world are taking time out to note the impact that the housing market, or let's hope it's not too significant or bad, but the pop of the housing bubble in Auckland, if it comes about, will not just affect those who have been buying homes in Auckland, speculating in property in Auckland, sir, it will affect the whole New Zealand economy. And this is the real problem, and this is why we need more than what is being offered by this government tonight. These are empty words that will change nothing about the real problem that we have in the Auckland housing market. The point is that this is a national issue, and the national government refuses to do anything about it. I noticed on a news article tonight that Rotorua prices are increasing. And for me, that feels good, being a Rotorua lad, and it's great to be a part of that. The difference is the fundamentals in the Rotorua economy are improving, and people are making choices to not so much speculate in the Rotorua economy, but move there because of real job decisions and choices, and so the market grows. This is not what we are seeing in Auckland. We are seeing New Zealand speculators, and more importantly, and more disastrously perhaps, we are seeing overseas speculators coming in and compromising lifestyle choices of everyday New Zealand. National does not want to bring this problem to a close, perhaps, as a fair summary of this legislation. They don't seem to want to solve the problem. Is it that feel-good factor? They don't want their voters in Auckland to suddenly be worried about the prices of their homes and so start to panic about what's going on there, and all of a sudden they're asking questions about what this national government is or is not doing. It's an observation. Whether it's fair or not is another question. Here is the lunacy of the situation though, Mr. Speaker. The current Finance Minister said, and I quote, "I'm sure there will be discussions about how the bright line test actually falls. We would expect that. But people need to understand, and this is where it gets good, Mr. Speaker, if it may be taxable under the bright line test, then it probably should be paying tax anyway under existing law." That was from the Minister of Finance. And the irony of irony, sir, is I completely agree with him. He couldn't be more right. And yet the argument from that side of the House tonight is it's not doing the job it was intended to do. And Mr. Robertson did speak to that with some eloquence, although I would suggest to Mr. Robertson and this national government that there are fixes under the intention tax rule that would see it being enforced and applied in a fair and reasonable manner so that we could actually fix the problem that we are observing in Auckland. Mr. Speaker, 10 minutes is simply not long enough to speak about all the problems in this legislation. People who simply buy property and then do it up and then flick it off are exempt. Trusts and companies are exempt. The definition of what is land or property falls within the purview of this legislation is so vague as to be meaningless. New Zealand First has said it before, and we will say it again. This legislation does not fix the housing problem in Auckland, and we need something sound, we need something substantial, and we need it now. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.